Right before something meaningful enters your life, there is almost always a quiet disturbance inside you, not chaos on the surface, but a subtle tension beneath it. You begin to feel restless without knowing why. Old thoughts resurface. Memories you believed were settled return with unexpected weight. It feels as if your inner world is rearranging itself, asking you to look again at parts of yourself you once avoided. This moment often arrives when external progress seems slow. Nothing dramatic appears to be happening, yet inwardly everything feels unstable. You question your direction. You doubt your timing. You wonder whether you misunderstood the signs that once gave you hope. This is not punishment, and it is not failure. It is the psyche preparing space for something larger than your current identity. Before a true blessing arrives, the mind frequently withdraws its usual sense of certainty. The roles you relied on feel thinner. The masks you wore for survival begin to crack. You may feel less confident, less defined, less sure of who you are becoming. What is actually happening is a shedding of outdated structures. The inner world cannot receive something new while it is still clinging to an old self-image. Another sign appears in your relationships. Certain people become distant, or conversations feel empty where they once felt alive. You may notice irritation toward patterns you previously tolerated. This is not arrogance or impatience. It is an unconscious realignment. The inner compass is shifting, and anything that no longer matches its direction begins to feel heavy. You may also notice an increase in solitude. Even if you did not choose it, silence grows louder. Time alone feels both uncomfortable and necessary. In this space, you are confronted with yourself without distraction. The mind brings unresolved emotions to the surface, not to overwhelm you, but to integrate them. A blessing that is not integrated becomes a burden. The psyche knows this and prepares accordingly. Right before a blessing arrives, fear often disguises itself as intuition. You may feel a strong urge to retreat, delay, or abandon what matters most. This is not a sign to stop. It is a threshold response. The mind senses expansion, and the ego reacts by trying to protect the familiar. Growth always feels like loss before it feels like gain. You might also experience a strange humility. The desire to prove yourself weakens. External validation loses its power. Success, as you once imagined it, no longer satisfies you. This is a signal that the blessing approaching is not merely external. It is something that will change how you relate to yourself, not just how others see you. Pay attention to the dreams, the recurring thoughts, the symbols that appear in quiet moments. The unconscious speaks softly before it speaks loudly. When life is about to shift, it whispers first. If you listen carefully, you will notice that the discomfort you feel is not pulling you backward, but inward. When the blessing finally arrives, it rarely looks the way the ego expected. It may come disguised as responsibility, truth, or a new level of self-awareness, but by the time it arrives, you will recognize it not by excitement, but by alignment. It will feel earned, not given. It will feel natural, not forced, and you will realize that the signs were always there, quietly preparing you to become someone capable of receiving it. Inner restlessness rarely announces itself loudly. It does not arrive as a clear warning or an obvious breakdown. Instead, it moves quietly beneath daily routines, creating a subtle unease that cannot be explained by external circumstances. You may wake up feeling unsettled, even though nothing is wrong. Tasks that once felt simple begin to feel heavy. Achievements lose their taste. This restlessness is not a flaw in your character, nor is it a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the inner world signaling that the current structure of your life can no longer contain what is forming beneath the surface. Emotional discomfort often follows this restlessness. Feelings arise without clear origin. Sadness appears without an event to justify it. Irritation surfaces toward things you once accepted without resistance. The mind searches for logical explanations, but none fully satisfy. This discomfort exists because the psyche is preparing space. Just as a room must be cleared before something new can enter, the inner world must loosen its attachments before transformation becomes possible. The psyche does not evolve by adding endlessly to what already exists. It evolves by subtracting what has become rigid. Inner restlessness is the pressure created when growth presses against outdated patterns. The old ways of understanding yourself begin to feel tight, like clothes that no longer fit. You try to adjust them, to rationalize them, to force comfort back into familiar forms, but the discomfort persists because the problem is not external circumstances but internal readiness for change. This stage often brings a heightened sensitivity to your own inner dialogue. Thoughts become louder, self-questioning intensifies. You begin to notice contradictions within yourself that were previously ignored. The part of you that wants safety argues with the part that longs for expansion. This internal conflict is not meant to be resolved quickly. It exists to loosen certainty. Certainty is useful for stability, but it is an obstacle to transformation. Emotional discomfort also acts as a signal flare, drawing attention to areas of the psyche that were neglected. Suppressed desires, unexpressed grief, and unrealized potential rise to the surface. These emotions may feel overwhelming because they were postponed, not processed. The psyche does not forget what the conscious mind avoids. When the time is right, it brings everything forward at once, not to punish but to integrate. Restlessness can also manifest as dissatisfaction with identity. You may feel detached from the version of yourself you worked hard to build. Roles you once took pride in feel empty. Labels that once provided direction now feel limiting. This does not mean those roles were false. It means they were temporary. Every identity serves a phase of development, and when that phase ends, the identity must loosen or collapse. This collapse is rarely graceful. Emotional discomfort accompanies it because the ego resists dissolution. The ego prefers clarity, control, and continuity. Transformation threatens all three. The discomfort you feel is the ego attempting to maintain structure, while the deeper psyche insists on reorganization. This tension is necessary. Without it, growth would remain superficial. Inner restlessness also disrupts time perception. You may feel impatient, as if something should already have happened, or you may feel stuck, as if time itself has slowed. This distortion occurs because the psyche is operating on a different rhythm than the external world. Inner transformation cannot be rushed without consequences. The restlessness exists to keep you attentive during this waiting period. Often, people misinterpret this stage as failure. They assume something is wrong with their motivation, discipline, or mindset. They try to fix it by forcing positivity or chasing stimulation. But restlessness cannot be distracted away. It demands attention. When ignored, it grows louder. When listened to, it begins to reveal its purpose. Emotional discomfort sharpens awareness. You become more honest with yourself, sometimes painfully so. You recognize patterns you no longer want to repeat. You see where you compromised your values for comfort or approval. This awareness hurts because it removes comforting illusions. Yet, without this discomfort, the psyche would have no reason to reorganize. This stage also tests patience. The blessing that follows cannot arrive while the old structure remains intact. If it did, it would either be rejected or misused. The psyche prepares carefully. It dismantles what is unnecessary, weakens what is rigid, and sensitizes you to deeper meaning. Restlessness is the energy driving this dismantling process. There is also a strange clarity hidden within the discomfort. Even as confusion increases, certain truths become undeniable. You may not know where you are going, but you begin to know where you can no longer stay. This knowing does not feel exciting. It feels sobering. It strips away false enthusiasm and leaves behind a quiet seriousness. Inner restlessness is often accompanied by moments of stillness that feel unusually intense. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Distractions lose their effectiveness. In these moments, the psyche is asking you to remain present without escape. What emerges in this space is not immediate answers, but deeper questions. Questions that shape the direction of transformation. The emotional discomfort you experience is proportional to the significance of what is forming. Small changes require minor adjustments. Major blessings require deep restructuring. The psyche prepares according to scale. If what approaches will change your sense of self, your relationship, or your purpose, the preparation will feel correspondingly intense. This stage is not meant to be endured with blind endurance, nor escaped through constant action. It asks for observation, to notice what feels unstable, to acknowledge what no longer resonates, to sit with uncertainty without forcing resolution. In doing so, the inner world slowly creates the space necessary for what is meant to arrive. When old identities begin to dissolve, it rarely feels like growth. It feels like disorientation. The sense of self that once provided stability starts to weaken, and with it the confidence that came from knowing who you were supposed to be. You may notice that familiar motivations no longer drive you. Goals that once felt meaningful now feel hollow. This does not happen because you failed to become that person, but because you succeeded long enough to outgrow them. Identity is formed as a response to necessity. At certain stages of life, you adopt behaviors, beliefs, and roles that allow you to survive, belong, or succeed. These structures are not false. They are adaptive. But adaptation becomes limitation when the environment within you changes. When the inner world expands, the old identity begins to feel restrictive, and the psyche initiates its quiet dismantling. As this dismantling begins, relationships often reflect the internal shift. People who were once central to your life may feel distant without conflict or explanation. Conversations lose depth. Shared interests no longer bind in the same way. This is not always due to disagreement or betrayal. Often, it is the natural result of inner realignment. When your internal orientation changes, the relational patterns built around the old orientation can no longer sustain themselves. This process creates a deep sense of loss. Even when nothing dramatic has happened, grief appears. You mourn versions of yourself that once felt solid. You grieve connections that shaped your past. This grief is confusing because it has no clear object. You may feel guilty for feeling detached or ungrateful. Yet this grief is an essential part of transformation. It honors what once was while making space for what can no longer be delayed. Certainty dissolves alongside identity. Beliefs you once defended with confidence now feel provisional. You question assumptions you never thought to examine. This uncertainty can feel like weakness, but it is actually a sign of increased psychological flexibility. The mind loosens its grip on fixed conclusions to allow more complex understanding to emerge. As identities dissolve, the ego experiences threat. It relies on continuity to maintain control. When that continuity breaks, anxiety increases. You may feel compelled to cling to familiar patterns, even as they lose meaning. This clinging intensifies discomfort because it resists an inevitable process. The psyche does not dissolve identities arbitrarily. It does so when they have fulfilled their function. The sense of loss deepens when external validation fades. Praise, recognition, and approval no longer satisfy as they once did. This is not because you no longer care, but because these forms of validation were tied to an identity that is no longer central. The psyche withdraws emotional reward from outdated sources to redirect energy inward. During this stage, people often attempt to rebuild certainty quickly. They rush into new roles, beliefs, or relationships to escape the discomfort of emptiness. But premature reconstruction creates fragile identities that collapse just as easily. The psyche requires a period of openness where nothing is fully defined, so that the next structure can form organically. This openness feels like standing on unstable ground. You are no longer anchored to who you were, but not yet connected to who you are becoming. Time feels suspended. Progress feels invisible. Yet beneath this apparent stagnation, deep reorganization is taking place. The psyche is recalibrating values, motivations, and priorities at a foundational level. Relationships that remain during this phase often change in quality. They become more honest, less performative. Superficial bonds may dissolve, while quieter, more authentic connections gain importance. This shift can feel lonely, but it is a necessary refinement. The inner world seeks resonance rather than familiarity. Loss before growth is not a metaphor. It is a psychological law. Something must be relinquished for something new to take its place. The mind resists this because it equates loss with danger. Yet without this relinquishment, growth remains conceptual rather than embodied. As certainty dissolves, intuition strengthens. You may find yourself guided less by logic and more by subtle inner signals. These signals are not yet clear directions, but they point away from what no longer aligns. This negative guidance, knowing what is no longer right, is often the first form of clarity to appear. The emotional weight of this stage comes from its ambiguity. There is no clear timeline, no external confirmation, no guarantee. The psyche asks for trust without proof. This demand feels unreasonable to the rational mind. Yet it is the only way deep transformation occurs. Over time, you may notice that despite the discomfort, there is a quiet sense of honesty emerging. You are less willing to pretend, less tolerant of inner contradiction. This honesty does not feel triumphant. It feels sober. It strips away illusions and leaves behind something raw but real. The dissolution of old identities and certainties creates an inner vacuum. This emptiness is not meant to be filled immediately. It exists to allow a more integrated self to emerge, one that is not assembled from external expectations but shaped by internal coherence. When solitude increases, it often feels imposed rather than chosen. Social invitations fade, conversations shorten, and the sense of being understood weakens. Even when surrounded by people, an inner distance remains. This withdrawal is not always caused by external rejection. Frequently, it is the psyche drawing energy inward. Attention that was once directed outward toward performance, validation, or distraction is redirected toward self-confrontation. In solitude, the noise of daily life loses its masking power. Without constant interaction, the inner world becomes louder. Thoughts you avoided rise uninvited. Emotions you postpone demand recognition. This can feel unsettling because the mind prefers movement to stillness. Stillness removes escape routes. It reveals what was hidden beneath routine. Self-confrontation begins subtly. You may notice repetitive thoughts, unresolved memories, or emotional reactions that feel disproportionate. These are signals of unresolved inner material. The psyche stores experiences that were never fully processed, especially those associated with vulnerability, shame, or grief. When solitude increases, the conditions become right for these experiences to surface. This surfacing is not random. The psyche has its own timing. It releases material when the conscious mind is strong enough to face it. Increased solitude provides the psychological space necessary for integration without external demands. Attention can turn inward without fragmentation. Unresolved inner material often carries emotional intensity. Feelings may arrive suddenly and without context. A sense of sadness may appear without a clear cause. Anxiety may increase even in the absence of threat. These emotions are echoes of experiences that were once suppressed for the sake of survival or adaptation. They return not to destabilize you, but to be acknowledged and understood. Self-confrontation requires honesty that goes beyond self-criticism. It involves observing patterns without justification or denial. You begin to see how certain behaviors developed as protective strategies. You recognize how coping mechanisms that once served you now limit you. This recognition can be uncomfortable because it removes excuses while increasing responsibility. Solitude also exposes internal contradictions. You may discover that your values and actions are misaligned. You may notice how often you silence your own needs to maintain external harmony. These realizations are painful not because they reveal failure, but because they reveal truth. Truth disrupts comfort, but creates coherence. During this phase, the mind may attempt to escape through stimulation. Excessive consumption, constant activity, or obsessive planning often increase as defenses against introspection. When these strategies fail, frustration grows. The psyche insists on being heard. The discomfort intensifies until attention turns inward willingly or unwillingly. Increased solitude often changes the quality of thought. Instead of focusing on immediate tasks, the mind begins to ask broader questions. Questions about meaning, direction, and authenticity arise. These questions do not seek quick answers. They exist to reorganize priorities. The psyche is shifting from adaptation to individuation. Integration is the central task of this phase. Integration does not mean eliminating difficult emotions. It means allowing them to exist without resistance. When emotions are felt fully, they lose their compulsive power. They become information rather than threats. Self-confrontation also reveals strengths that were overlooked. As you face vulnerabilities, you discover resilience that developed quietly over time. You recognize patterns of endurance, creativity, and insight that emerged from previous difficulties. These qualities often remain invisible during periods of outward focus. The sense of loneliness that accompanies solitude is not always a sign of isolation. Sometimes it is the result of internal reorganization. Old relational dynamics dissolve before new ones can form. The psyche temporarily withdraws from connection to clarify its own orientation. This withdrawal can feel painful, but it prevents premature attachments that would recreate old patterns. Dreams often intensify during this phase. Symbols, recurring images, and emotional narratives appear with unusual clarity. These dreams are expressions of the unconscious attempting to communicate what cannot yet be articulated consciously. Paying attention to them can provide insight into unresolved themes and emerging directions. Self-confrontation requires patience. The psyche does not reveal everything at once. It works in layers, bringing forward what can be integrated at each stage. Rushing this process can lead to overwhelm. Avoiding it leads to stagnation. Balance is required even when it feels elusive. In solitude, you may notice a growing intolerance for superficiality. Small talk feels draining. Performative interactions feel hollow. This is not a sign of superiority. It is a sign that the psyche is prioritizing depth over breadth. Energy is conserved for what truly matters. As unresolved inner material is integrated, emotional reactions gradually soften. Triggers lose intensity. Patterns become conscious. Choice replaces compulsion. This transformation does not announce itself dramatically. It reveals itself through increased inner stability. Solitude eventually becomes less threatening. It shifts from something to endure into something that supports clarity. You begin to trust your own presence. This trust forms the foundation for future connection, one based on authenticity rather than necessity. The psyche uses solitude as a crucible. Within it, fragmented parts are brought together, examined and reconciled. What emerges is not perfection but coherence, a sense of inner alignment that allows you to engage with the world without losing yourself. As expansion approaches, fear rarely announces itself honestly. It does not say that something meaningful is about to happen. Instead, it disguises itself as doubt, hesitation, and sudden skepticism. Thoughts arise questioning timing, readiness, and worthiness. What once felt possible now feels dangerous. The mind begins to search for reasons to delay, to wait, to remain where it is. This reaction is not a flaw in intuition. It is the ego responding to the threat of transformation. At the threshold of growth, the ego's primary task is preservation. It was shaped by past experiences, successes, and failures. It knows how to survive within familiar boundaries. When expansion appears, those boundaries are challenged. Fear intensifies because the unknown cannot be controlled. The ego interprets uncertainty as risk, even when the deeper psyche recognizes opportunity. This fear often feels rational. It presents itself as logic, caution, and practicality. You may hear internal arguments about responsibility, realism, or the potential for loss. These arguments are convincing because they are rooted in past experiences where caution was necessary. But context matters. The same defense mechanisms that once protected you can become obstacles when circumstances change. Doubt increases precisely because the next step requires a redefinition of self. Expansion is not merely acquiring more, it is becoming different. The mind resists this because identity is tied to consistency. To grow beyond current limits means leaving behind familiar reference points. Fear arises to maintain continuity. This stage is marked by a narrowing of attention. Instead of seeing possibilities, the mind fixates on potential failure. Small uncertainties are magnified. Hypothetical risks feel immediate. This cognitive constriction is a stress response. The psyche attempts to reduce unpredictability by limiting perception. Intuition during this phase can feel distorted. Genuine inner guidance becomes difficult to distinguish from fear-based impulses. You may feel a strong urge to retreat or abandon what previously felt aligned. This urge often arrives suddenly, without new information. It is a defensive reflex rather than a considered decision. Fear at the threshold often brings physical sensation. Tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, restlessness, or fatigue may appear. The body participates in this resistance. It mirrors the psychological tension between staying and becoming. Awareness of these sensations can help differentiate between genuine danger and symbolic threat. This phase tests trust, not blind optimism, but trust in the internal process that has guided you this far. The psyche does not move toward expansion without preparation. The very discomfort you feel is evidence that groundwork has already been laid. Fear intensifies because the step ahead is real, not imagined. Doubt also seeks external validation. You may feel compelled to ask others for reassurance or permission. Opinions that align with fear feel comforting. Opinions that encourage growth feel threatening. This selective listening reinforces hesitation. The psyche, however, requires internal authority to proceed. The threshold phase often creates a sense of urgency paired with paralysis. You feel that something must change, yet action feels impossible. This tension exists to refine intention. Action taken purely to escape fear leads to regret. Action taken with awareness leads to integration. Fear signals that the current identity cannot cross the threshold unchanged. Something must be relinquished. Old beliefs about capability, control, or safety are challenged. The ego resists because it equates change with annihilation. In reality, what dissolves is not the self, but a limited version of it. During this stage, the mind may revisit past failures as evidence against moving forward. Memories are selectively recalled to reinforce caution. This retrospective bias serves fear. It overlooks resilience, adaptation, and growth that followed those failures. The psyche narrows the narrative to maintain stasis. Despite the intensity of doubt, there is often a quiet undercurrent of clarity. Beneath the fear, a sense of inevitability persists. You may feel that even if you resist, the change will occur in some form. This tension between resistance and acceptance defines the threshold. Alignment does not feel like confidence at this stage. It feels like honesty. You recognize that staying where you are is no longer true. Fear does not disappear, but its authority weakens. You begin to see it as a signal rather than a command. The threshold is not crossed through force, but through acknowledgement. When fear is observed without obedience, it loses its capacity to dictate behavior. The psyche integrates fear as part of the process rather than an obstacle to it. This stage is brief compared to the preparation that precedes it, yet it feels elongated because of its intensity. Time seems to stretch. Decisions feel heavier. The psyche slows perception to ensure awareness at the moment of transition. When expansion finally occurs, fear does not vanish instantly. It transforms. It becomes alertness rather than paralysis. The energy once used to resist change is redirected toward engagement. The doubt that once narrowed perception gives way to presence. The threshold exists to ensure that what enters your life is met consciously. Fear is the final guardian, testing readiness not by absence of anxiety, but by the capacity to move with it rather than against it.